All right, so to pick up on what you heard there from the short excerpt, part of the reason the debate was so critical was because this was the first time you had a live presidential debate being televised on TV. And it would lay the groundwork for what was to come moving forward with regards to the public's expectations pertaining to presidential debates. Now, this is also a different era, right? Where people don't have access to the internet, people don't have access to social media. So the debates were more critical back at that point in time in order to hopefully get voters to swing over to your side. And as you heard, several million voters were convinced of Kennedy's performance and ended up voting for him. That would prove critical to the outcomes of the election, as it would be an extremely close election. Now, going into the debate and the election itself, Nixon was seen as having more of the political experience in Congress, and he had served 8 years as Eisenhower's VP. I would say that position, more than his service in Congress, was part of what set him apart from Kennedy, because the political experience, I think, is sometimes a little overstated with Nixon. Kennedy and Nixon both came into Congress in 1947 as freshman congressmen together. You could maybe argue that Nixon had a little bit more of the quicker rise. Nixon had served under the House of Un-American Activities Committee, positioning himself as a real staunch anti-communist, really made a name for himself at that point. And then obviously as Eisenhower's VP, he's serving during a time of real growth and prosperity in much of the country. Now, in contrast, many people would question Kennedy's youth as well as his religion. Kennedy was Catholic, and you kind of see how much we developed as a country in terms of the religious aspect of a presidential candidacy. Big difference in 2020 compared to where we were in 1960. Kennedy's Catholic faith actually became so much of an issue that he had to come out front and center and address it, where he would be telling audiences, I'm not a Catholic who's running for president. I'm running for president, and I happen to be Catholic. Meaning that he was trying to push the religious issue aside. But we know the history of Catholic discrimination in the country. Kennedy was trying to make that a non-issue. Now go to 2020. Biden is our first Catholic elected since Kennedy. But I can't recall it becoming a major campaign issue over the course of the 2020 campaign. It was rarely ever mentioned. It shows you how much the country has moved away from that being a central issue when it comes to presidential elections. Now, if you were a Catholic family, during this time frame, and especially after Kennedy got elected, you typically had 3 images that were hanging up in your house, whether it be the living room or the dining room. You had an image of Jesus, you had the Pope, and you had Kennedy. And sometimes they weren't in that order. Sometimes the patron Saint Kennedy was the first one I taught. That's how a lot of Catholics viewed him as almost a deity-like figure because of his ascendancy to the highest office. So back to the debate. On TV, clearly Nixon seemed much more worn down. The other thing that you didn't get to see was that the lights that they were under, they weren't accustomed to this, very hot. Nixon could see being dabbing his brow multiple times during the course of the debate. How would that make Nixon appear to the American public? Zoe.
That he's uncomfortable.
Yep, he's uncomfortable, he's maybe nervous, right? That wouldn't present the best image. The camera clearly favored Kennedy. And when I say favored the younger, more handsome Kennedy, Kennedy's only a few years younger than Nixon. But on TV, and we'll see here in this image, it seems to take a few years off of Kennedy and add a few years onto Nixon. Now, the ironic part here is with regards to the comparison between TV and radio. If you had listened to the debate on radio, you would have thought Nixon won. But there's a clear distinction if you had watched it on TV. Kennedy was the clear winner as far as the American public was concerned. And that really ended up mattering because millions of voters would use that televised debate to swing their vote over to Kennedy. Take a look at the image here. You can just see from the still photos that the suit that Nixon was wearing bleeds into the background. That really did not do him any favors. Kennedy was the one that stood out more on camera, and that was a big impact at that time. Probably the closest modern day comparison we can make would be the 2008 election, which featured John McCain for the Republicans and Barack Obama for the Democrats. McCain was the one at that time that was viewed as having such a strong amount of political experience, and Obama was the one who was really being tested because of his youth. He was relatively young, his mid-40s, but he was also a freshman senator, didn't have a whole lot of experience in DC, but the charismatic Obama, really hearkening a lot of the charisma of the Kennedy, was able to win that election, largely based on a big part of the way he was able to connect to the American public. So if Kennedy made those connections through color TV, Obama was making those connections via Facebook, where people were getting messages from candidate Obama at that time. There was also another connection. Americans, especially once Obama got elected, kind of fell in love a little bit with the whole first family. You had Obama and his wife Michelle, and then the two girls that were fairly young at the time. A lot of people who remembered the generation of Kennedy said it took them back to that time when you had this young, youthful family occupying the White House. Now, with regards to the election of 1960, and part of the reason it becomes so important, it had just as much to do with Kennedy as we'll see as it was his running mate. Lyndon Johnson, who was selected partly to help carry the state of Texas, because Texas was seen as being critical to securing the South. And Johnson hailed from Texas. Now, this decision will prove to be even more consequential, of course, in a few years when Kennedy is assassinated. And then Johnson will become his successor. And we'll see dealing with some significant issues on the domestic front with civil rights, and then also inheriting the Vietnam War. The election itself would be the closest since 1884, and every little move by each candidate mattered. Not only was the debate critical to Kennedy, but in October of 1960, the Kennedy team made a call in Atlanta when Martin Luther King was arrested. And that call was to help Martin Luther King get out of jail. That call was widely credited for African Americans, specifically those who were more readily available to vote in the North, also voting for Kennedy. So the question became, is Kennedy going to be the president who is much more aggressive on civil rights? At 43 years of age, Kennedy is the youngest president ever elected. Not the youngest to serve, that of course is Teddy Roosevelt, but he ascended to the presidency once McKinley was assassinated. And as I mentioned, the first Catholic, which at the time, in 1960, that was a pretty big deal in this country, especially when you consider, the years of discrimination that many Catholics had confronted. Now, let's take a closer look at the electoral map. Now, since Reconstruction, the South, as a block of states, has primarily been voting for what political party? Yeah. Try again. Democrats, of course, right? The South, the white supremacists of the South are associated with the Democratic Party. So take a look. Kennedy is the Democrat in blue and Nixon the Republican. Looking here at the South, we've got a majority of those states that are voting for Kennedy. So looking ahead, what is the potential fallout or the potential risk for Kennedy being more aggressive on civil rights? Nate. He may very well lose the vote of the South if he is more aggressive on civil rights. That's definitely important to consider, as we'll be looking at the movement in the 60s over the next several days. Now, look, I said before about the closeness of the election. The popular vote there, razor thin, separated by a mere 0.1% of the popular vote. So that's why I said every move seemed to matter. Once Kennedy is elected, he has this representation, at least in the public eye, of the Camelot years, that he is representative of sort of the mythical King Arthur and the idyllic family. I mean, you just take a look at that image right there. It looks like the perfect postcard that you want to send out at Christmas to everybody, right? The picturesque family. They look beautiful. The kids, are young and vibrant. Yeah, that's what the public sees, right? What they don't know is what's going on behind closed doors. The womanizing of John Kennedy that his wife, is fully aware of in many cases. However, who is not aware of what's going on behind closed doors? The public. You're exactly right. Why? Why does the American public not realize what's going on at this time? Think about what they don't have access to that we have at this point in time. Diego.
Would it just be telephone?
They had the telephone in 1960, but what would be available to all of us that we've had for the last several years that is not available in 1960? Why does information spread so quickly? Back to you, Diego.
Oh, like just the internet?
The internet would be one, all right? I would also say 24-hour cable news. Think about Bill Clinton. Was he able to keep his indiscretions behind closed doors? No, right? Here's the other deal. You have sort of an old boys club that exists in the media, meaning that there is this sort of understanding between Kennedy and many members of the press that, hey, if you don't disclose anything that you happen to see going on at the White House, I'll make sure that, I'm treating you well when it comes to press coverage. On a domestic front, a big focus then for Kennedy and his successor will be to look at what's going on with regards to poverty. So Kennedy's new frontier was his domestic agenda that would attempt to improve the economy and to assist the poor. Now, this is something that will really be carried out more by his successor, Lyndon Johnson, and his war on poverty under the Great Society. Kennedy also is widely credited a part of his legacy for ramping up the space program. As we had talked before break, in 1961, at Rice University, he gives the moon speech, pledging to get a man on the moon before the decade is out, which the United States will barely succeed there in July of '69. In order to really help kickstart the economic slump that had come out of the end of the 1950s, Kennedy proposed a pretty lofty tax cut, which works in the short term. And over the course of the whole decade, really, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, will be pretty successful at cutting down poverty. Both Kennedy and Johnson are widely influenced by the book The Other America from Michael Harrington, which painted this picture of basically two Americas that existed. One of the haves, another one of the have-nots. And in essence, forcing the federal government to try to really address both urban and rural poverty in America. They'd be fairly successful, as I said. By the end of the decade, they'd be able to cut the poverty rate in half. However, long-term, not really all that successful, because if we look at the poverty rate as it stands now, in comparison to where it stood in 1960, we are not much better off today than we were in 1960. So that should tell you something. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a brief moment.